A few years ago, I made a video exploring the concept of lost islands, which, trust me, is a very real phenomenon that's been happening since the end of the last ice age. You see, 20,000 years ago, the planet was in a period of glacial expansion, and so much of the world's water was held up in polar ice caps that sea levels fell more than 120 meters lower than they are now. This exposed thousands upon thousands of new islands all across the planet's surface, many of which remained dry for millennia, giving them time to develop their own biological communities. Though as our planet warmed back up, the glaciers melted, adding water back into the oceans. This raised sea levels, causing these islands to gradually sink back beneath the waves, washing away whatever unique wildlife might have inhabited them, leaving us to wonder what these fleeting lands might have been like while they were still dry, and how they might have affected our history if they were still around today. And you guys know me, if there's one thing I love wondering about, it's islands. So even though we've done this once before, I suspect there's still plenty more to find by searching for even more lost islands. Okay, so we might as well start with what inspired this whole video in the first place. Recently, I made a video about the Galapagos, and in that we took a look at the paleogeography of this island chain. Doing this, we learned that with lower sea levels, not only did many of the islands expand and even connect to one another, but at least 2 new islands in the archipelago were exposed. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to go into any more detail than this in that video, though this idea was so cool to me that I started writing this script just so that I could explore it a little more. Today, we call these elevated areas Hancock Bank and McGowan Reef, but 20,000 years ago, they stood as islands roughly equal in size to the modern-day Isla Floriana and Isla Española. Only these were located right at the center of the archipelago, in a position to receive species from every angle. And this is what makes these lost Galapagos Islands so fascinating to me, as they would have provided new breeding grounds for the already distinctive Galapagos flora and fauna to colonize, and from there begin evolving into even more peculiar life forms. Or at least that's what I thought before double-checking the climate graphs. These show us that glacial periods only last about 50,000 years from start to finish, so that's how long, at most, these islands could ever have been dry land for. While that might sound like a long time, on an evolutionary timescale, 50,000 years is a pretty quick event, meaning it's unlikely these islands could have developed any truly unique species of their own. That being said, they still would have received species from the surrounding islands, populating them with an equally wacky collection of life. Of course, it's hard to know for sure what exactly would have found its way here, but is there anything more specific I can figure out about these islands? Well, if we look at their topography, we can see they're both rather flat platforms, which explains why they're submerged today, and even 20,000 years ago would have formed some incredibly low-lying lands. This is useful to know because we learned from the Galapagos video that the lower elevations of these islands are mainly desert, dominated by cactus trees, whereas it's only within the highlands that you'll find rich forests. Applying this model to these islands suggests they would have received very little moisture and were likely covered for the most part in desert. Knowing this, it's easy to imagine most of their surface would still have been bare volcanic rock, where the only vegetation capable of growing would be the native Opuntia cactus. Being located at the heart of the Galapagos, it's possible for these islands to have received both the regular short-growing species as well as the tremendous cactus trees found growing on islands like Santa Cruz. Which of these ended up succeeding here largely depends on whether the Galapagos tortoise ever made it to these islands as well, as their ability to eat any low-growing cacti would give the cactus trees an advantage here. Though either way, it's clear Opuntia cacti would have conquered this landscape, possibly even more so than on the other islands, given how barren these likely were when they first emerged from the ocean. Knowing this, it's questionable whether any additional vegetation besides cacti could have grown here, and therefore it's even more questionable if these islands could have supported any interesting animals. The giant Galapagos tortoise, for instance, may not have been able to find enough food across these rocky plains to establish a population here. The same goes for many of the highly specialized birds this archipelago is known for, as without the specific plants they'd evolved to feed on, these islands would likely be unable to attract and support such inhabitants. That being said, there are at least two Galapagosian animals I just know would have thrived here. First are the marine iguanas. Given their aptitude for swimming, I have no doubt they would have found their way to these islands pretty quick. Once here, the iguanas would be largely unaffected by the scarce landscape because they'd evolved to feed on intertidal algae, which there would still be plenty of. In fact, the rocky terrain here actually would have been a positive for them, as these are the sorts of environments marine iguanas prefer on the other islands, as they're the perfect place to warm back up after jumping into the cold ocean water. The more I think about it, without any other competition, marine iguanas could have dominated these islands to an extent not seen anywhere else in the Galapagos. Though I don't believe they would have been completely alone either, as the Galapagos penguin is another native that could have reached these islands. Similar to marine iguanas, their ability to swim and feed off of ocean resources rather than land resources would have made them more equipped to find and colonize these islands. But don't worry, the penguins feed on fish while iguanas eat algae, so there wouldn't have been any direct competition between them. The only thing I can imagine these animals competing over would be for space on the warm volcanic rocks, which both species like to use to bask in the sun. Though without much vegetation to cover up the rocks, I think it's fair to say there would have been enough space for everyone, and together this would have produced a distinct assortment of plants and animals on these temporary islands, while still being related to the broader Galapagos community. In terms of human history, however, I honestly can't imagine these islands would have affected very much at all. And even if they had made it into modern times, they would likely still be uninhabited nature preserves, just like the rest of the Galapagos. If you're more interested in the alternate historical impacts Lost Islands could have had, then we can move on to our second case study on the opposite side of the Pacific. As I said earlier, lower sea levels would have exposed thousands, if not millions, of new islands throughout the Pacific Ocean alone. Of course, we don't have enough time to explore each one, and besides, most were too small to be very notable, but I did find one large landmass within Micronesia. Not only would every individual island in this archipelago have been greatly expanded during this time, but we can also see this even bigger underwater platform would have emerged as Micronesia's largest landmass. Measuring over 5,000 square kilometers, this single island would have contained nearly twice the land area that exists in all of Micronesia today, drastically altering the landscape of this region. And I just think that's so interesting as well, how what was once the primary member in this archipelago isn't even dry land today. And I mean, sure, had this island persisted into modern times, I still don't think it would have had any kind of outsized macro effect on world affairs, but at least for the Micronesian people, this lost island would have completely rewritten their history. What exactly the effect of this would have been is again hard to say, but I feel like there being one large island as opposed to a bunch of far-flung smaller islands would have helped build a more unified, more centralized Micronesian state, rather than the various warring island kingdoms that existed here upon European arrival. Perhaps this could have even become the capital of a Micronesian maritime empire, similar to the Yap Empire that briefly existed here, but capable of exerting even greater influence over the rest of these islands. Containing more land than the rest of Micronesia combined, I also expect this would have become home to many more Micronesian people. So not only would there be a different history, there would literally be more Micronesian history, with the majority of it taking place on this island, what would have been considered the Micronesian mainland. Beyond this though, it's really tough to say what specific impacts this island might have had. But again, that's part of the fun in finding lost islands. One small change in the Pacific could have rewritten an entire people's history in a million different ways. So feel free to explore how in the comments. Though if you want some lost islands that could have altered world history, then we can move on over to the Indian Ocean. In the previous video, we learned how the summits of the Mascarene Plateau would have been exposed during this time, creating a series of large islands beyond Madagascar. Although this alone was fascinating, it's not quite the full story, as if we peer even deeper into the Indian Ocean, we'll find another 2 such island chains rising from the Chagos-Laccadive Ridge. And I know what you're saying, technically the Chagos Archipelago is not fully lost, as small parts of it remain above water as atolls to this day. But besides the main atoll, we can see several more islands fully submerged today that were once emergent, so this still counts in my opinion. Plus, in modern times, the Chagos Archipelago combined consists of only 56 square kilometers of dry land, whereas 20,000 years ago, the main Chagos Island alone would have extended over 13,000 square kilometers, with an additional 1,400 square kilometer island to the south and a 560 square kilometer island to the north, as well as several more smaller islands, totaling over 15,000 square kilometers of freshly exposed land area at the center of the Indian Ocean. This alone would have been historically notable, but then consider the Laccadive Ridge to the north also would have been far more exposed. Together, these would have stood as a series of stepping stones from India to the Laccadive Islands to the Chagos Islands to the Mascarene Islands to Madagascar and eventually to Africa, bringing these 2 distant lands into much closer contact with one another. And of course, I know there's always been some degree of interaction between India and Africa dating back thousands of years, but in a world where these islands facilitated the safe crossing of this ocean, I can only imagine there would have been drastically more exchange between these places. And this is something I believe could have seriously altered history, especially in regards to Africa, whose current geography isolated it from the wider world. Specifically, the Sahara has acted as a barrier for most people entering the continent, causing sub-Saharan Africa to historically be left out of most important trade routes. This isolation resulted in this part of the world being unable to partake in the same cultural, economic, and technologic exchanges that were taking place across the rest of Afro-Eurasia, leaving them rather behind, which in turn made them vulnerable. But if we now imagine that these islands opened up a connection from India to Africa, bringing with it every religion, currency, and technology present along this trade route, that has the potential to alter the course of history. With the ability to get African goods like gold or rubber to markets, wealth could have flowed into Africa rather than out, leading to greater economic stability and potentially more powerful states. After all, functioning trade networks are what pay for things like armies and ammunition, so having sub-Saharan Africa integrated into the wider trade network could have helped even greater empires form here. Altogether, with lower sea levels, the Indian Ocean would have been a lot more busy, with these islands connecting otherwise disparate lands and helping spread ideas even further. Just around the other side of Africa brings us at last into the Atlantic Ocean. Which is good because for this video I really wanted at least one example from each ocean. But to be honest, I initially struggled spotting any truly interesting and new lands here. Though I'll admit this is mostly my own fault, as I've already covered most of the obvious ones in previous videos. This forced me to get real up close in my search, and one of the first places I checked for lost islands was the Walvis Ridge protruding from Africa's southwestern coast. This unfortunately yielded no results, as the entirety of this ridge sits well below Ice Age sea levels, but following it even deeper into the ocean will find more signs of volcanism littering the ocean floor. The largest cluster of undersea volcanoes lies directly south in what are known currently as the Discovery Seamounts. 20,000 years ago, however, the very peaks of these underwater mountains would have been exposed as a series of 9 small islands, forming a fleeting archipelago in the South Atlantic. Though that's not quite all, as to the north, the RSA Seamount, the Yaquant Seamount, the McNish Seamount, the Zinker Seamount, and an unnamed seamount would have formed another small archipelago consisting of about 5 tiny islands. Then to the southeast lies Meteor Rise, where 6 or 7 more seamounts could have poked above the surface as well. Together, this would have created a series of island chains across the temperate South Atlantic, an archipelago of archipelagos located in one of the most remote spans of ocean on the planet. From a historical perspective, these again likely would not have affected very much, considering the nearby Gough Island and Buvatoya Island were both left uninhabited until European explorers arrived, so I think it's safe to say all of these would have been empty as well, and therefore would not have altered human history all that much. The same, however, cannot be said about the natural history of these islands. Comparable in size to the Galapagos, but even more remote, I can't help but imagine what kinds of unique flora and fauna these island chains could have assembled. And with the nearest mainland being the southern tip of Africa over 1,000 miles away, this actually presents quite an interesting possibility. To fully understand why, though, we need to first look at a phytogeographic map. This is sorta similar to the map of biogeographic realms we've seen before, the only difference being phytogeography studies specifically the distribution of plant life across this planet, whereas biogeography takes into account plants and animals and fungi and everything else. Looking only at plants, 6 distinct phytogeographic kingdoms have arisen across this planet, with the smallest and most curious one being this one at the very southern tip of Africa, the Cape Floristic Kingdom. Due to the isolation of this end of Africa, the plant life here represents one of the most unique collections of flora anywhere on the planet, where nearly 70% of the plant life here is endemic, meaning they're found nowhere else on Earth. One day I'll need to make a full video on this place, but for now, all this means is that the flowers on this one small stretch of coast are truly unlike any others, and so if the plants from this region were to have colonized these islands, they would have built up an even more peculiar floral community here. Whatever flowering plant made it to these islands first would not only have the opportunity to establish themselves as the dominant vegetation type, but from here they'd begin evolving to fill every other niche up for grabs. Had these islands existed for millions of years rather than just a few thousand, these bizarre flowers may have eventually produced a native tree, just as we observed with the daisy tree that evolved back in the Galapagos, producing an entire ecosystem type unique to these islands. And naturally, once plants were established here, animals would soon follow. The first inhabitants of these islands would likely be birds, as they're both capable of finding and making use of the resources here. If the existing islands nearby are any indication, these would be a favorite stopover point for migrating seabirds, and most definitely would have attracted some to take up residence. In fact, the closest existent island, Gough Island, even features its own flightless bird, the Gough moorhen, a prime example of island syndrome. Although it's unlikely any of these islands existed long enough for resident seabirds to fully go down this path, I wouldn't be surprised if one had at least started evolving in this direction, staying within the confines of these islands. The only animal from the African mainland that I think could have made it to these islands are Cape penguins, whose seafaring nature and the currents may have brought them here. Arriving on these islands, they would have found their version of paradise, no predators and plenty of fish, so it's easy to imagine them successfully establishing a population after washing ashore. Had these archipelagos been a permanent fixture on the Earth's surface, it's even possible an endemic penguin population would have eventually evolved here. Overall, the geography of the Discovery Islands no doubt would have produced one of the most peculiar laboratories for evolution on this planet, perhaps even earning the title of the Galapagos of the Atlantic. Though beyond that, there's not much more I can say about these small archipelagos without it being total speculation. So what did we learn from all this? Or to rephrase that, what is there to learn from Lost Islands? If none of these exist anymore, then why bother studying them? Well, if you ask me, the search for these phenomena help reveal features on this planet that have otherwise been overlooked, and in doing so, present interesting opportunities for us to test our understanding of both natural and human history. And that's no mistake, I call them Lost Islands for a reason. By definition, these are places hidden from us through both space and time. And it's only by connecting our knowledge of oceanography with our understanding of the Earth's paleogeography that we can even begin to reveal these fascinating features. That's why I thought this subject was worth revisiting, because ultimately the search for these Ice Age artifacts is really just a practice study in how this planet works and changes over time. And now that you all share the same knowledge and understanding as me, you can join in trying to find even more lost islands.
The deep parts of the ocean, as much as 6 or 7 miles deep in some places, are covered with ridges and valleys and undersea mountain ranges. In future years, explorers of the ocean bottom will use these maps just as explorers used early maps to explore the land.
Hey everyone, before you all go, I'd just like to remind you of my second channel, Archive Dive, where I watch these old programs in their entirety. If this video ignited your passion for exploring the ocean floor like it did for me, you'll definitely enjoy the story of Sealab 2, one of the very first underwater habitation systems. This was legitimately one of the coolest things I've ever watched, and something I wish more people knew about. So if you'd like to continue learning about ocean exploration with me, check out the link in the description. Also, there are still a few prints of this poster and this map up on my store for sale right now. If you found yourself admiring them at any point while watching, now would be a great time to pick one up right before the holidays. There's a link in the description for that as well. Besides that, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all again very soon.
Beneath this great watery surface is another world of animal and plant life, of chemicals and minerals, and an ocean floor full of mysteries, an ocean floor that has really never been explored.